Hello and welcome again to Bible Doubter. The story I want to focus on is the story of Abraham sacrificing his son Isaac. This is a story early in the Bible. The whole story is in Genesis 22 if you want to take a look at it, because I'm just going to skip over it very briefly. I've heard this story horrifically misunderstood, ridiculed, mocked, and you can understand. Why would we worship a God who would call us to sacrifice children? Isn't this a bit barbaric? Why is it even in there? Why would we put the story in there? Did somebody make that up? Why is there any possible or plausible explanation that makes this story relevant or important or even true? I want to give you some ideas about that. First of all, just to recap, God called Abraham to do just that. God said, take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about. So he's going to the region of Moriah, to a section that will be called Mount Moriah later. And there he is to go and sacrifice his son. Now, he goes with two servants, if you read the whole chapter, and before they get to the actual location, he says, okay, you stay here. Isaac and I will go and worship the Lord on that mountain, and then we will come back to you. Strange choice of words if you're planning on sacrificing your son when you get there. Now, in the book of Hebrews, in the New Testament, under the New Covenant, the author of Hebrews is saying Abraham's faith, the reason he said that was his faith was strong enough that he could believe even God could raise the dead. Now, he didn't have to sacrifice his son. As the story goes, where he bound his son on the altar they made, lifted up his knife, and the Lord stopped him and said, I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky. Now, there was a substitute sacrifice. When he looked around, he saw a ram caught by its horns in a bush and sacrificed it. And this is the important part. When Abraham looked up in the thicket, saw a ram caught by its horns, he went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, the Lord will provide. And to this day it is said, on the mountain of the Lord it will be provided. So in that time, among his people, it became a saying, a phrase. On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided. A substitute sacrifice. Well, skip ahead 5 or 6 or 7 centuries to when Israel was an established state. Through the time of Moses, through the centuries of slavery, through the times of the judges, all that stuff. They have a state. David is now the king, and he sins in a way you can read about more in detail, and a plague breaks out. And God says to stop the plague, he has to build an altar. I'm going to read this passage. Then the angel of the Lord ordered Gad the prophet, to tell David to go up and build an altar to the Lord on the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. So David went up in obedience to the word that Gad had spoken in the name of the Lord. Now, he bought that plot. It says, and I'm skipping through, he bought that plot. He said, I will not sacrifice something to the Lord that costs me nothing. So he bought it, and it became his property. Now later, his son, Solomon, used that plot. In this passage, 2 Chronicles 3:1, then Solomon began to build the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah, where the Lord had appeared to his father David. It was on the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite, the place provided by David. So there's the temple now on that same mount that about 700 or 800 years ago Abraham was called to sacrifice his son, but a substitute was provided. Then, skip ahead another 1,000 years, when the Christ is coming through and doing his 3-year ministry, and then in Jerusalem, where, as it said, on the mountain of the Lord, it will be provided. What? The substitute, the Christ, when God would send his own son, and when the time came for them to lift up those hammers to pound the nails in, there was no angel that said, stop. Now I know this, now I know that. No, he had to go through with it because he was the sacrifice. He was the substitute. Christ was the substitute. And this was all pictures. Everything in the Old Testament are picture portraits painting and leading us to the Christ, fulfilling all these things. So While I'm not convincing everyone, I'm trying to give people who are sincere doubters a reason to understand the purposes, specifically, of that unusual story. Thanks for coming to Bible Doubter.